One of the big questions that you see debated in certain forums online today is the argument that the traditional grammar translate method of learning biblical Greek is dead. It's really not appropriate for learning a language. Well, in this video, we're going to make some, or at least begin to make some arguments to try and just balance that view a little. So, let's get into it. So for quite some time now, I've been following the discussion by linguists and commentators and podcasts and Facebook groups and all these kinds of different places, and I've even read books arguing against the grammar translate method, the method of taking a grammar and learning the language, particularly the koine Greek. And instead, people are arguing for what's called the natural language acquisition approach. This is the same approach to learning language that we learn French or German with. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this approach, and I'm not trying to be opposed to this approach, but I've been thinking about this as I've been reading these books and watching the discussions and listening to the podcasts and all those kinds of things. And I have some thoughts. And so a little while ago, I reached out to Dr. Rob Plummer, who's also been involved in this conversation just a little bit, to talk about the grammar translate method, the traditional approach to learning Greek, and the natural language approach, to ask the question, well, which of these two is the best approach? And should we ditch the grammar translate method and all switch over to the natural language approach? This video is going to be over really probably two videos I'm going to release on this subject. We sat down, Dr. Rob Plummer and I sat down and we had a discussion about this. And so we're going to break our discussion into two pieces and really publish those two pieces separately. So this is a little bit of us sort of thinking together and talking together about the approach, the natural language approach versus the grammar translate approach. Now, we both use the grammar translate approach, and it might seem that maybe that's a little bit biased against the natural language approach, but for the most part, the people who are making the natural language approach are largely only teaching from that side anyway. So let's just put this as this is part one of a conversation that we're starting to have. Okay, so we want to have a conversation with the natural language advocates as well, because we think that, yeah, there's some advantages to the natural language approach, but there's also some advantages to the traditional approach that should not be easily thrown out. And that's what we really want to address in this video. Before we get into it, let me ask you to smash that like button. That'll just help the YouTube algorithm know that this is helpful. And if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell, and that way you'll find out when the next edition of this in this series will come out. So let's start with the first question here. And really the first question we're going to ask is, if we listen to all the rhetoric and all the arguments for the natural language approach, is it all true? Is it really as good as it says it is? Well, let's get into that conversation between Dr. Rob Plummer and myself.
But it is true that if you wander into some Facebook groups or you wander into some online chat groups, it does seem like you can kind of break people into more traditional pedagogy where they're working through grammatical categories systematically versus more of a modern language acquisition approach to Greek. And I would say if there is a fundamentalist streak among them, it would be in the communicative language approach, right? Because you're hearing from some people on that side, this is the only and the best way. And at least from what I've seen in social media, sometimes quite dismissive and even mocking of a traditional approach to studying biblical languages, which I think is unfortunate. Now, the best in both camps, I think, are very charitable and willing to learn from both sides. I think the Biblingo guys are great this way. They're very they don't believe they're the only game in town. They want to supplement and they want to work together. And that's great. And I want to work together. I want to learn. I want to use the best approach that I can. I want to incorporate more living language, communicative language approaches as best I can into a traditional seminary Bible college curriculum. That's part of the challenge. If you meet 2 or 3 days a week, and it's very difficult to get students to the working ability they need to have for the biblical text, to read the best commentaries and use them, and that with a communicative language approach over just a year. But I see some real strengths to it. I'm eager to incorporate the strengths. I'm hopeful that those more the newer methods would be eager to learn from more traditional methods too.
On top of that, though, there's also this question of is learning a language like French the same as learning a language like ancient Greek? I mean, are those two things the same in terms of the learning process? Are the outcomes really the same? Well, again, let's get into that question with Dr. Rob Plummer.
Of course, you should be learning French and Spanish and Chinese from the get-go as a spoken language, something you're hearing, listening to, speaking, because that's the end product, that you're going to go around speaking Japanese or French, using it in interactively with people. Very few people will be in an environment where they're able to learn an ancient language that no longer has a living speaking community of any size, nor will they be using it that way, really. They're using it to read ancient text, hopefully an ancient text to which they bow in authority, to the authority that God has, his authority invested in that text. And so they're reading it to know God and to know his word. And so that's a little bit different than learning so that you can do business in Japanese, right? And it's a little bit, we have to admit, it's artificial to create a speaking community. It's not wrong, but it's just a bit artificial. And there's some potential distortions and dangers that we introduce because there is no legitimate, real speaking community of first century Koine speakers who speak it natively. It's all been reconstructed and recreated with varying degrees of accuracy.
And I think that's really important, particularly when we think about the culture and the historical background and the assumptions that the first century speaker would bring into a conversation compared to the assumptions that a 21st century speaker would bring into the conversation. Even if the language is the same, there's cultural assumptions and therefore the way you use language that you can't necessarily bring in if you were, from a 21st century perspective, that we should expect to see in ancient times as well. And on top of that, I would add that, like you say, because the Koine language spread throughout the Greco-Roman Empire and was adopted by a whole bunch of different cultures, we're kind of seeing the same thing today as well, where we are now taking the same Koine idea and adapting it to modern cultures all over the place as well. And again, it's not wrong. I think it just raises some risks.
Yeah, let me give an example of one of the dangers. So, very good system that I was looking at here. I think it's great for people, for example, when they see the word kradzo, to think of someone crying out. Imagine it, see it, do it yourself. Kradzo, kradzo. That's a wonderful way to learn. That's really good. And we can have videos of people doing that. Now, in one of the systems I was looking at, which again is a good system, it had people, different age people doing this, crying out, and then it had a bird. And it looked to me like a bird singing, which I thought, that's strange. Is this word used for a bird? I mean, strange. So I looked it up in LSJ, Little Scott Jones, and it is used of a bird, but only of a raven croaking, right? Of a raven like cawing, right? Which we could see how that would fit, but it wouldn't be used of a bird singing. And when the picture, I can't recall exactly what it was, but it didn't look like it didn't look like a crow or a raven croaking, cawing. And so you can see how well-intentioned and really well-designed stuff can introduce semantic distortion, right? Because somebody, maybe they had a text, a raven, kradzo, they think it's a bird calling, but it's only in sort of a crowing sense. And so then people learn a flawed semantic range that's reconstructed. There's you have to know Koine Greek extremely well to create a spoken system that really respects the original semantic domains of those words and constructions.
So it should be evident from the discussion that we've just been having that there is some risk when you take an ancient language and you try to bring it into the 21st century. there is worldview assumptions built into the language that don't always translate well into the first century, or that we don't necessarily know well enough to be confident in the way we're using those those grammatical constructs or principles or whatever it happens to be. And again, this is where linguistic principles really are important, and there's a lot of work to yet be done to really understand some of these, and we have to be careful as teachers, right, when we use these approaches. So you want to be careful about the approach you're taking. And this is one of the, I think, the distinctions between the natural language approach, which then brings the 21st century worldview and merges it really with the koine language, as if it's another country with its own culture in the Mediterranean sort of basin that then is adopting koine for itself. Now, in case you're thinking, you guys are just dissing on natural language, I hope it doesn't seem that way. There is actually some real advantages to the natural language approach, and we want to really address the big one, I think, in this video as well. And so we're doing that in this next segment with Dr. Rob Plummer, and that really is around the active use of the language. And this raises a number of kind of discussion points and questions, which we're going to go through now, including really, is the problem the grammar translate method itself, or is the problem kind of where the teachers take the grammar translate method? So as we get into this one, as Dr. Plummer and I talk about this together, we'll sort of talk about maybe there's something that as proponents of the grammar translate method, we can change, because I think some of the Biblingo guys and some of the guys who are using the natural language approach have some really good points on this side of it. So let's get into it. Let me flip it back though. Let's switch it back the other way, because there's obvious some advantages of the natural language approach as well, and we want to capture some of those too. And I think perhaps the strongest advantage is having that active knowledge of the language rather than purely just a passive knowledge, because now you're being forced to think about how to communicate in a new language, which allows you to internalize that in a much clearer and stronger way than you would if you were just reading it. I think when we read, the risk is that we're working through observation only rather than by, actually trying to think through how words should be formed and how they should work together. And I know you've done, in your grammar, you've done some work to ensure that some active vocabulary or active acquisition takes place. But do you want to talk about that as well a little bit? You've thought about this probably a little more than I have and its advantages. So,
well, I do. I mean, it's a very basic thing, but in my classes, I do require the students to learn the vocabulary, not just Greek to English, but English to Greek. They have to be prepared to do it both ways. They're wiring their brain both ways. In the beginning with New Testament Greek textbook, in the end, there are sentences that are in English, and students are asked to put them into Greek. Of course, there's always a challenge with that, because usually any English sentence could be rendered in Greek 2 or 3 different ways. So that's a little challenging, because students may choose a slightly different word, a slightly different construction that's equally correct. That's a difficult, it's a little bit difficult to provide an extensive key on that. I do think, like Biblingo has a set of vocabulary flashcards that's stacked for the beginning with New Testament Greek grammar, live video flashcards or whatever. I think that's great, and I encourage students to check that out. I'd be delighted if they subscribe to Biblingo and find those resources complementary to what we're doing. I also, in class, I try to illustrate for people how to act this out with their children, how to make language learn, but it'd be great, wouldn't it, if we all lived in a monastery together for a few years and we only spoke Greek, and but we don't live in that. We live with families who are not going to speak Greek with us, and work at jobs where people are not going to speak Greek with us. And so we have to live in the real world that we live in. People go to Greek camp, Hebrew camp. They want to do that for 2 weeks, and that helps wire you. That's great. I'm not against that. I think it's wonderful, but I do think we have to realize there are limitations to it. I also, sometimes students will get really into this, and I say, that's all fantastic, but every one of the commentaries you're reading that you find helpful is written by someone who didn't learn Greek that way. Like, if you show, most of the people who I know who are really into communicative language, that's what they're really into. They're not writing really helpful commentaries on Romans or John or things like that. So we have to see the fruit the fruit of the traditional approach to grammar has produced some very helpful things for the church.
Yeah, and I think that's one area I was sort of hoping to sort of talk about a little bit too, is I think one of the key distinctions between the two is that the outcomes, the original intended outcomes, and I'm not talking about what students go into. I'm thinking more from a methodological point of view. The GTM approach, the Grammar Translate method, was really built to understand the language in order to be able to do exegesis. Well, at least, let me rephrase that. Maybe it was in order to understand the language, and then to do exegesis came along as a secondary desire later on. And in seminaries, I think today, the desire to understand the language has kind of been washed out a little bit. And and so a lot of seminaries don't teach reading now at all, and the level of understanding a student will come out of seminary with is often much less than the level required to be able to read, and let alone, I think, really do exegesis well. One area I do really agree with the Biblingo guys on is that you do want to be able to read so you can do exegesis well. And I think a lot of seminaries, like the seminary I went to, I really enjoyed it. It was a great seminary, but it was all focused on exegesis, and we didn't really have any reading classes until we got to, like, I did a reading in the patristics class, and that was pretty much it. Do you want to talk about that? I think this is one of the issue. So what I boil this down to here is, I don't think the issue with GTM is that it doesn't prepare you to, it's not sufficient or adequate. I think it's more in the way it's used in a lot of seminaries rather than the problem with the process itself. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with your main underlying point there, in that we need to get students reading longer sections of text, reading more text, reading them quickly, and building confidence in fluency of reading. I agree with that. I think that would be a good thing to do. I also think it's never been easier to do that, right? And I see, even among students, we have on campus some students who have clubs. They meet together, reading club. They're reading Greek together. That's great. I love that. Also, it's never been easier, for example, with the Olive Tree Bible Study app. You download the MP3s of the entire Greek New Testament read. It's read Erasmian. Maybe you prefer another pronunciation. That's fine. Find another pronunciation. But you could listen to that while walking or running, especially the narrative portions of the Bible. Like, you read through Matthew on your own, and then you listen to it, and you can hear it and see it. And that's a form of internalize. You're not speaking it, but it is a deeper form of internalization that is taking Greek as not as a code. Sometimes people wrongly present a more traditional pedagogy as thinking language as a code. They're these kind of straw men that people attack, and language is obviously communication, and so. But I'm all in favor of more listening, more reading, and if people have the ability and the environment where they can do it, speaking. That's fantastic.
So I hope that this video has been helpful to help you to think through the distinction between the natural language approach on the one hand and the grammar translate method, the traditional approach, on the other hand. Now, there are certainly a lot that both camps can learn from one another, and I think ultimately this is where this is all going. We're trying to work together, at least we should be, to try and come up with a pedagogical approach that will make more sense. And it may be that even making too much of a distinction, making something that's too, joining these two actually may not be the best thing, because people learn in different ways. And sometimes learning using one process will help with another. But there's another thing too that I really think is important. And we're going to talk about this in the next video on this series, and in the subject. And that is that the two approaches don't exactly have the same endpoint. But I'm going to save that until the next video. So if you want to see that, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so that you find out when the next video comes out. And if you haven't already done so, smash that like button. So if you're interested in learning biblical Greek and you're interested in the approach that I have in Master New Testament Greek, then I would encourage you to go download my roadmap, to mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap is totally free, and that will also help you to know when the Mastery membership next opens up and give you an opportunity to join us for our next Greek program. So go ahead and download that today. Thank you so much for joining us to watch through this video, and I look forward to sharing the next one with you probably in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you then.